The hum of machinery filled the air as Samuel, an elderly man in his late 70s, carefully maneuvered his old-fashioned cleaning cart through the bustling hallways of the military base. The walls were lined with state-of-the-art technology, every gadget and device more advanced than anything Samuel had ever imagined. Yet there he was, pushing a cart filled with worn-out mops, rags, and cleaning solutions, as he had done for decades. Samuel's movements were deliberate, each step measured as he made his way to the main meeting room. The polished floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, but Samuel wasn't there to admire the cleanliness. He was here for one reason: to do his job. His hands, though aged and worn from years of work, handled his tools with precision and care. There was no rush in Samuel's world. Every task, no matter how small, deserved his full attention. It was a routine he had perfected, one he felt at peace with. The door to the meeting room creaked open, and Samuel entered, pushing his cart inside. The room was already prepared for a high-level briefing, with large screens displaying classified data and a long table set for the military officials who would soon arrive. As Samuel moved to the far corner to begin his work, he noticed a young officer entering the room, a lieutenant colonel by the look of his uniform. "Hey, what are you doing here?" the young officer snapped, his tone sharp, as if Samuel's presence was an intrusion. "We're about to have a very important meeting. You're not supposed to be in here." Samuel didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to clean the corners of the room with careful strokes, his focus unwavering. The officer stood there, arms crossed, eyeing him with disdain. "Didn't you see the new cleaning equipment? Why are you using that old thing?" the officer continued, sneering at the ancient mop in Samuel's hand. "It's a waste of time. That old mop doesn't even work right. You should be using the new equipment. We don't need you here messing up the place." Samuel glanced at the officer, his eyes calm and steady. "It works just fine, Lieutenant Colonel," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in service, though his words didn't seem to reach the officer. The lieutenant colonel was unmoved. "You're really stuck in the past, aren't you?" he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "This is a modern base, with modern technology. You're just slowing things down." Samuel ignored the young officer's harsh words, continuing his task without a hint of annoyance. He had seen far worse than a disrespectful officer in his time. But just as he moved to adjust the corner of the room, the officer stepped forward and reached out, grabbing the corner of Samuel's jacket. It was a brief, almost careless action, but one that would change everything. Samuel stiffened, sensing the movement. He had grown used to the occasional jostling, but this time something was different. The officer's hand brushed over the small ribbon pinned to Samuel's jacket, a ribbon that had been there for decades, a symbol of something far greater than any of the officer's empty words. The officer's fingers brushed against the ribbon, and for a brief moment, Samuel's face hardened, but he quickly masked it, returning to his cleaning. The officer, still unaware of the significance of the item, grinned. "You should really try the new equipment. It's far superior," he remarked, turning to leave. He didn't see the glint in Samuel's eyes, the subtle shift in the old man's demeanor. What the officer had just touched, however, was not just any piece of fabric, it was the Medal of Honor. As the officer exited, Samuel remained in the room, alone with his thoughts. His hand gently traced the ribbon on his chest. The weight of the medal was light, but the memories it carried were far heavier. Samuel had long ago learned that some things were better left unsaid, and that the past had a way of staying hidden until the time was right. Outside the room, young Corporal Miller had been quietly observing the exchange from the hallway. He had been stationed at the base for several years, and unlike the arrogant lieutenant colonel, Miller had always respected the old man. Something about Samuel had intrigued him since the first day they had met. Despite his humble position, there was a quiet strength in Samuel's presence, an unspoken history that Miller couldn't quite place. Miller's curiosity piqued. He quietly made his way back to his post. But something had stirred within him. The old man was more than just a cleaner, more than just a fixture in the military base. There was a story buried deep within him, a story Miller was determined to uncover. As he passed the hallway, Miller glanced back at the meeting room and thought of the ribbon, the Medal of Honor that had just been touched by the lieutenant colonel. There was no way that little piece of fabric was just a decoration. No, it was a testament to something far more significant. Miller knew he had to learn more. He needed to find out who Samuel really was. The next day, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something important was buried within Samuel's past. He had seen many veterans over the years, but Samuel was different. There was something about him that didn't add up. The way the older man had handled the officer's disrespect so calmly, almost as if he had been through far worse, intrigued Miller. And then there was that medal, a small ribbon on an old jacket that had been so carelessly touched by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. Miller made up his mind. He needed to know more about Samuel, and the only way to do that was to ask around. As the day passed, he waited for an opportunity to speak with someone who might know the truth. That afternoon, Miller found himself in the break room, sipping coffee and chatting casually with a few of the senior officers. He didn't want to seem too obvious, so he kept the conversation light, at least for the time being. After a few minutes of small talk, he finally brought up the subject. "Hey, do you guys know anything about Samuel, the cleaner?" Miller asked, his tone casual, though there was an edge of curiosity in his voice. The room fell quiet for a moment. One of the senior officers, Sergeant Thompson, looked up from his coffee with a raised eyebrow. "Samuel? You mean the old guy who cleans up around here?" Thompson asked, his voice slightly dismissive. "He's just an old vet. Nothing special. Been working here for years, cleaning up after us." But there was a slight hesitation in Thompson's words, a moment of doubt that didn't escape Miller's notice. The older officer might have brushed it off, but Miller could sense there was more to the story. "I heard he was in some special unit during his time," Miller continued, trying to push a little further. "Anyone know which one?" Sergeant Thompson shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering to the other officers in the room. It was clear they weren't eager to talk about Samuel, but Miller could see the faint traces of respect, maybe even fear in their eyes. "You might want to ask Colonel Matthews," Thompson said finally, lowering his voice. "He might know more. But let me warn you, Miller, sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." Miller nodded, though he didn't fully understand the caution in Thompson's voice. As soon as the conversation shifted to other topics, he excused himself and headed toward Colonel Matthews' office. Colonel Matthews was one of the highest-ranking officers at the base, a no-nonsense leader known for his sharp mind and tough demeanor. He had been stationed here for years and had seen countless soldiers come and go. If anyone knew about Samuel, it would be him. Miller knocked on the door and entered the office, standing at attention as Matthews looked up from his desk. "You needed something, Corporal?" Matthews asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Sir," Miller began, "I wanted to ask you about Samuel the cleaner. I know he's been around here for a long time, and I've heard some things about him. Can you tell me more about his history?" Matthews' face remained neutral, but for a split second, Miller saw his expression change. There was something behind his eyes, a recognition that sent a chill down Miller's spine. "Samuel." Matthews repeated, his voice low. "Why are you asking about him?" Miller hesitated, but decided to press on. "I saw the medal on his jacket, sir. The Medal of Honor. It's not something you just give to anyone. I think Samuel might have been part of something more important than just cleaning up this base." Matthews' expression hardened. "I don't know where you heard that," he said, his voice now colder, "but Samuel's past is not something we talk about here." Miller stood frozen, confused by Matthews' sudden shift in tone. It was clear that the colonel knew something, but he wasn't willing to share. Matthews sighed and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "Listen, Corporal," Matthews said quietly, his voice softening just a bit. "Samuel is a man with a past. A past that's not for public knowledge. He's done things in his life that most people could never even imagine. But he's here now, doing his job. And that's all you need to know." Miller was about to ask more, but Matthews raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not telling you this to discourage you, but I need you to understand something," Matthews continued, his gaze unwavering. "Sometimes the past is better left buried. Samuel made his peace with it a long time ago. You should too." Miller left the office feeling more confused than ever. Matthews had been cryptic, and his reluctance to discuss Samuel only fueled Miller's determination. There was a story here, and he was going to find it, no matter the cost. The next morning, as Miller made his way back to his post, he passed the meeting room once again. This time, Samuel was there, moving slowly and methodically as he cleaned the floors. The old man didn't look up as Miller approached, but there was something in the way Samuel carried himself. Something quiet, almost resigned, but filled with a deep understanding. Miller couldn't help but speak. "Samuel," he called out softly, stepping closer. I know you've been through a lot. I just want to know your story. Samuel paused, his hand resting on the mop handle. He didn't turn to look at Miller right away, but after a long moment, he spoke. Some stories, Samuel said quietly, are meant to stay in the past. But Miller wasn't ready to give up yet. Why the Medal of Honor? What happened? For the first time, Samuel turned to face him. His eyes, though tired, held a depth that sent a shiver through Miller's spine. You really want to know? Samuel asked, his voice low and steady. Then I'll tell you. But understand this, what I did, what I saw, it's not something most men can live with. Miller nodded, feeling the weight of Samuel's words. He had no idea just how deep this story would go, but he was ready to hear it. Samuel's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Miller felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of gravity settling over him as Samuel began to speak. The old man paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts, his gaze distant as if he were looking back on a time long buried. You asked about the Medal of Honor, Samuel began, his voice calm but tinged with a sadness that Miller hadn't expected. It's not something you earn in a single battle or mission. It's not a simple decoration for bravery. It's a reminder of things you'd rather forget. Miller stepped closer, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Samuel would finally share the truth behind his past. The Black Wolf Unit, Samuel continued, his eyes now focused on Miller with an intensity that made the younger man feel as though he were being pulled into a different world, one of shadows, danger, and things better left unsaid. We were a unit unlike any other. Special forces, yes, but we operated in the shadows. Our missions were classified, often off the books. We were sent to do the jobs no one else could or would. The world would never know about us, and that's how we preferred it. Miller could hardly believe what he was hearing. The Black Wolf Unit? He had heard rumors over the years, stories about a secretive military unit involved in covert operations, but he had always assumed they were just that, rumors. But here, standing before him, was a man who had lived it. Why the secrecy? Miller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel's face hardened, his eyes darkening with the weight of memories long suppressed. Because some things should stay hidden, he said, his voice thick with the pain of remembering. Some things the world is better off not knowing. You see, we didn't just fight enemies on foreign soil. We fought shadows, those we couldn't see, but knew were there. The kind of enemies that haunt your dreams long after the battle is over. Miller listened intently, hanging on every word. He had no idea what Samuel had been through, but it was clear now that his past was far darker and more dangerous than anything he had imagined. One mission, Samuel continued, his voice faltering slightly, I lost more than just my comrades. I lost a part of myself. We were sent into a remote area of the world, no one really knew where, to take out a high-value target. The intel was wrong, and we walked right into a trap. We were ambushed, surrounded, outnumbered. We fought for hours. Some of my team didn't make it out alive. And those of us who did, well, we were never the same. Miller felt a pang of sorrow for Samuel, for all the pain he had suffered in silence. But the old man wasn't done yet. That's when I earned the Medal of Honor, Samuel said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. But it wasn't for bravery in battle. It was for something else. After the ambush, I found myself alone behind enemy lines, surrounded by men who wanted nothing more than to see me dead. But there was a child, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She was caught in the crossfire, but she wasn't dead. I couldn't leave her there, not after everything we had been through. So I carried her out of that hellhole, under fire, and brought her back to our base. It wasn't the military victory they wanted to honor. It was the fact that I saved an innocent life, at the cost of my own men's lives. Miller felt a lump in his throat. He had expected stories of military triumph, of heroic battles and victories, but Samuel's story was different. It was a reminder of the true cost of war, the lives lost, the sacrifices made, and the burdens carried long after the fight was over. You think the Medal of Honor is a symbol of victory, don't you? Samuel asked, his voice bitter. But what they don't tell you is that it's a symbol of loss. A reminder of the things you couldn't save, the things you couldn't change. Every time I look at that medal, I see the faces of those I couldn't protect. I hear their screams in my dreams. It's not a reward, it's a curse. Miller stood in stunned silence, his mind racing to process everything he had just heard. He had no idea that Samuel's life had been so intertwined with death and pain. The old man wasn't just a cleaner at the base. He was a hero, one whose story had been buried in the sands of time, forgotten by all except those who had seen the true cost of war. Samuel's hand brushed over the medal once more, a faint sorrow crossing his features. I didn't ask for the medal. I didn't even want it. But it was given to me, just like the burden of carrying those memories with me every day. Some people think I'm just an old janitor. They think I've lived a quiet life, but the truth is, I've never stopped fighting. Miller stood there, taking in the gravity of Samuel's words. He now understood that the old man's quiet presence at the base, his humble work, was part of his way of coping with the trauma of his past. Samuel had never sought attention or recognition. He had lived with the weight of his experiences, choosing to quietly serve rather than revel in the glory of his past actions. I never asked for anything, Corporal, Samuel said, his voice soft but firm. I don't need people to know what I've done. But if you want to understand why I live the way I do, why I keep to myself, it's because the world doesn't need another hero. What it needs is people who remember the cost of heroism, and the price we all pay for it. Miller didn't know what to say. He had expected a war story, but what he had gotten was so much more, a glimpse into the soul of a man who had lived through hell and come out the other side, not unscathed, but with a quiet strength that few could understand. Thank you, Samuel, Miller said finally, his voice thick with emotion, for sharing that with me. Samuel nodded, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of his lips. It's the least I can do. As Miller turned to leave, he knew that he would never look at Samuel the same way again. The old man had given him a gift, a story of true heroism, one that wasn't about medals or glory, but about sacrifice, loss, and the heavy burden of doing what was right. The days following Samuel's revelation felt different. Miller walked through the halls of the military base with a new sense of awareness, every corner of the building now holding a deeper significance. He saw the officers moving briskly, heads down, focused on their tasks, but now in his mind, they all seemed like actors playing parts on a stage. In contrast, Samuel's quiet presence was like a hidden truth, something that couldn't be ignored once it had been revealed. Samuel had opened a door into his past, one that Miller wasn't sure he was ready to fully understand. The deeper he delved into the story, the more questions arose, questions that might have been better left unanswered. Miller couldn't shake the haunting image of the young girl Samuel had saved, the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on him. A part of him wanted to know more, to understand how such a man could live with the ghosts of his past and still go on with life. One afternoon, as Miller sat at his desk, lost in thought, his thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of the phone. He picked it up quickly. Miller, came Colonel Matthews' voice on the other end. I need to see you. Now. The urgency in Matthews' tone made Miller's stomach tighten. He stood up quickly, his heart beating faster as he made his way to Matthews' office. What had he done wrong? Did Samuel's story reach the wrong ears? When Miller arrived, Matthews was already standing at his desk, looking over a set of documents. The colonel glanced up, his face unreadable. Close the door, Corporal, Matthews ordered. Miller did as instructed, suddenly aware of how serious the situation felt. What's this about, sir? Miller asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. Matthews sat down and gestured for Miller to take a seat. He did so, waiting for the colonel to speak. There was a long pause before Matthews finally spoke, his voice low. I'm sure you've been digging into Samuel's past, Matthews said, watching Miller closely. I told you before that some stories are better left untold. What you heard from Samuel is just the tip of the iceberg, Corporal. His past is complicated, dangerous. Miller's pulse quickened. What do you mean, sir? Matthews sighed, leaning forward. Samuel is more than just a former member of Black Wolf Unit. He's involved in things that go beyond military operations. There are people, important people, who still remember his actions. And they're not happy that he's here. He's a reminder of things they want buried. Miller felt a chill run down his spine. Who are these people, sir? Why would they want to silence him? Matthews paused, his gaze flickering toward the window before returning to Miller. Because Samuel isn't just a hero in the eyes of the military. He's tied to things that would ruin lives if they ever came to light. His missions weren't just about saving lives, they were about eliminating threats threats to power and influence. Some of the people he took down were no ordinary enemies. They were political figures, corporate giants, people who held sway over the highest levels of government. Miller's mind raced. He had known there was more to Samuel's past than just the war stories. But now, the stakes seemed far higher. Are you saying Samuel's enemies are still out there? That they're trying to find him? Matthews nodded grimly. Exactly. They never forget, Corporal. They never forgive. And Samuel, he's a living symbol of everything they lost. Miller felt the weight of Matthews' words settle on his shoulders. He had thought that Samuel's quiet, humble existence at the base was just that, a peaceful retirement. But now, it seemed like Samuel was living on borrowed time, surrounded by shadows from a past he could never fully escape. You can't tell anyone about this, Miller, Matthews continued, his voice firm. Not even Samuel. He's been carrying this burden for far too long. It's up to us to protect him. If anyone finds out what he did, or if they find out where he is, they'll come for him. And they won't stop until they've silenced him, permanently. Miller felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been given a glimpse into a world he wasn't prepared for, a world of power, danger, and intrigue. He had thought his mission was just about uncovering a soldier's past, but now it felt like he had stumbled into something much darker. I understand, sir, Miller said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. I won't say anything. Matthews gave him a sharp nod, his expression softening just slightly. Good. Just remember, Corporal, you're not just dealing with a man. You're dealing with a legend. And legends are dangerous, even to those who try to protect them. With that, Miller stood and left the office, his mind reeling with the new information. He had come to the base with a simple goal, to uncover the truth about Samuel. But what he had discovered was a far more complex and dangerous reality. The past had a way of coming back, and sometimes, the cost of uncovering it was higher than anyone could imagine. As Miller walked down the hallway, his gaze once again fell on Samuel, who was quietly cleaning the floor in the distance. The old man seemed like nothing more than a simple janitor, but now Miller knew the truth. Samuel's story wasn't over yet. It had just begun. And the shadows of the past were closing in. The following days felt like they were drawn out in slow motion. Miller couldn't shake the images of Samuel's past, of the Black Wolf unit, the covert missions, the high-profile targets, and most haunting of all, the enemies Samuel had made along the way. Colonel Matthews' warning echoed in his mind constantly. The shadows from Samuel's past were not distant memories. They were alive, stalking, and ready to strike. Miller continued his routine, but every step felt heavier. He still saw Samuel around the base, cleaning the same floors, handling the same tools with methodical care. There was nothing extraordinary about the old man in the eyes of others. To everyone else, Samuel was just another member of the support staff. But Miller knew better now. He knew that the quiet old man had lived through things that most men would never understand. And those things hadn't been left behind in the past. They were still there, lurking just beyond the surface. One evening, as Miller was walking past the break room, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. It was Sergeant Thompson and a few of the other senior officers, talking in low voices. Miller tried to act casual, but something in their tone made him stop in his tracks. Did you hear? Thompson was saying. They've been asking questions. About Samuel. Miller's ears perked up, and he stepped closer, just out of sight. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but he had to know more. They've been sniffing around, checking up on his records. And now they're getting close, another officer added. I heard they've already sent someone to track him down. Miller's heart sank. He knew who they were talking about. Those shadows from Samuel's past were finally catching up with him. Who are these people? Miller whispered to himself, his pulse quickening. They don't know, Thompson muttered. But they're military contractors. Mercenaries, really. I've seen their kind before. They were the ones who took out Black Wolf unit members after the mission. They're not the kind of people you want to get mixed up with. Miller's mind raced. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Samuel's past wasn't just a relic of history. It was a ticking time bomb, one that was about to explode. He had to warn Samuel. But what could he do? Samuel had always kept to himself. What if he didn't want to be saved? What if the old man had already resigned himself to the fact that his past would always come back to haunt him? That night, Miller couldn't sleep. He paced his small quarters, thinking of nothing but Samuel's safety. He knew he had to act, but he didn't know how to approach the situation. He couldn't go to Colonel Matthews. He had already been warned not to get involved. But if the mercenaries were closing in on Samuel, time was running out. The next morning, as Miller walked toward the maintenance hall where Samuel usually worked, he saw him standing by the supply closet. Samuel was bent over, carefully organizing his tools. For a moment, the sight of the elderly man, so calm and at ease, made Miller hesitate. Could he really drag Samuel into this nightmare? The old man had already lived through hell once. Wasn't it enough? But as Miller stepped closer, he saw something in Samuel's eyes. A quiet understanding, a weariness that spoke of years of carrying the weight of things better left unsaid. Samuel had never wanted the attention, but it was clear to Miller now, he couldn't stand by and let this happen. "Samuel," Miller called out, his voice low but urgent. The old man turned slowly, meeting Miller's gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. There was no need for words. Samuel had known that Miller had uncovered the truth. He had known that someone would eventually come for him, just like they always did. "How much do you know?" Samuel asked quietly, his voice steady but heavy with the burden of truth. Miller swallowed hard. "Enough to know that you're not safe. The people from your past, they're coming for you." Samuel nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this moment. He straightened up and walked over to a nearby bench, sitting down with a sigh. "They never forget," Samuel said, his voice tinged with resignation. "The past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run. You don't escape it, not really." Miller sat beside him, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. "What should we do? How do we stop them?" Samuel looked at him, his eyes sharp despite his age. "There's no stopping them, Corporal. Once you cross certain lines, the only way out is forward. You run, you fight, or you hide. But they always find you." Miller's mind raced. He wanted to protect Samuel, but how could he fight against a shadowy force with so much power and influence? "I won't let them get to you," Miller said firmly. "I'll help you. We can find a way to get you out of here, keep you safe." Samuel's eyes softened for a moment, and he placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. "I appreciate the sentiment, Corporal. But this is my fight. It's always been mine." Miller's chest tightened with frustration. "So that's it? You're just going to let them come for you? After everything you've done for this country, you're just going to give up?" Samuel's gaze hardened, and for the first time, Miller saw the soldier within him, the man who had faced death countless times without flinching. "I didn't give up, Miller. I never gave up. But the cost of what I've done is higher than you can imagine. It's not about running or fighting anymore. It's about making sure they don't get to the people who don't deserve this." Miller was about to say something more when the unmistakable sound of a vehicle pulling up outside caught his attention. He looked out the window, his eyes narrowing as he saw a black SUV parked by the entrance. His instincts told him that the time to act was now. "Samuel, they're here," Miller whispered, his voice tight with fear. Samuel stood, his expression calm but determined. "It's time." Without another word, he walked toward the back exit of the maintenance hall, his every step measured, as if he had already faced this moment before. Miller followed close behind, but deep down, he knew that this was no longer just a story about protecting a man, it was a fight for survival. The shadows were closing in.